Good evening and welcome to History at Dark. There's an image everyone knows, a dragon-proud ship cutting through gray swells, warriors in horned helmets, though the real Vikings never wore such things, raising their swords to the cold sky. A people of fire and fury who burst upon the coasts of Europe and changed the world forever. But there's another image, one almost no one knows. A lonely farmhouse on Greenland, half buried under snow, the hearth cold, the tools still in their places as if someone had set them down just for a moment and never came back. No bodies, no signs of violence, only silence, and the slow, patient work of the ice reclaiming everything those people had once built. That is how the Viking Age ended. Not in flame, not in a final battle, not in blood and smoke, but in a quiet disappearance. And that disappearance is one of the most fascinating and least told mysteries in European history. How could a people who settled Iceland, reached North America 5 centuries before Columbus, sailed through the Mediterranean, and served as bodyguards to Byzantine emperors in Constantinople? How could that people simply cease to exist? The answer isn't a story of defeat, it's a story of transformation, a story of how a people slowly dissolved into the world they had helped create, until one day they were no longer Vikings, but something else, something new. Tonight we'll follow them to their most remote corners of the earth, to Iceland, to Greenland, to the shores of North America. We'll watch their gods die and their kings transform. We'll reach the moment when the ice returned and the sea no longer carried them. And in the end, we'll understand that the Vikings didn't disappear because they were conquered. They disappeared because they won. Before we begin, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel. It's a simple way to support this work, and it truly means a lot. I'm always curious where in the world you're joining me from tonight. I'd love to read about it in the comments. Now, get comfortable. Let the noise of the modern world fade away. Let's travel back together to a time of ice and oak, of runes and open sea. Who were the Vikings, really? To understand how the Vikings disappeared, we first need to understand who they actually were, because the image history has handed down is wrong in almost every detail. The word Viking doesn't describe a people, it describes an activity. In Old Norse, the word Vikingur means, roughly, someone who goes raiding, someone who prowls the bays and coastlines. It was a verb that became a noun, a profession that became an identity. The people we call Vikings called themselves Norsemen, men of the north. They came from what is now Norway, Sweden, and Denmark, a world of long, dark winters, narrow fjords, and rocky shores where farmable land was scarce. That landscape shaped them. It made them sailors, because the sea was the only road out of the tightness of home. It made them traders and warriors, because resources were scarce and survival demanded risk. But they were also farmers, craftsmen, poets, lawmakers. Norse society was largely governed through the Thing, an open assembly where free men debated laws, settled disputes, and held kings accountable. In Iceland, this evolved around the year 930 into the Althing, one of the oldest parliamentary assemblies in the world, which still exists today. The Vikings left runic inscriptions from Greenland to Turkey. They created the sagas, epic prose works of remarkable literary sophistication, surprisingly close in spirit to modern literary fiction. They were philosophers of fate who believed in the inevitable Ragnarok, the doom of the gods, and still got up every morning and put their boats in the water. Their expansion began in the late 8th century. In 793, Norse warriors raided the monastery of Lindisfarne off the English coast. For Christian Europe, it was a shock of almost biblical proportions. Out of nowhere, out of the mist of the north, came men in dragon ships who destroyed the sacred and dragged monks into slavery. It was the beginning of an era that would hold Europe's attention for nearly 3 centuries. But that era had an end, and the end began not with a defeat. It began with a success. It's easy to picture the Viking Age as a period of unrelenting violence, but the truth is more complex, and in many ways, more impressive. Yes, there were raids. Yes, there was plunder. But running parallel to all that, and often carried out by the same people, was something remarkable. A vast trading network stretching from the Arctic to the Black Sea. The Swedish Norsemen, known as the Varangians, didn't sail west like their Norwegian and Danish counterparts. They went east. They paddled their shallow longboats down the rivers of Russia, the Volga, the Dnieper, the Neva, trading furs, honey, wax, and slaves for silver coins from the Islamic Caliphate and silk from Byzantium. Along the way, they founded cities, Novgorod, Kiev. The region that would one day become Moscow was once deeply shaped by Norse culture. The very word Russia may derive from the Old Norse Roths, the rowers, the name Slavic peoples gave to the Varangian traders. In the west, the picture was equally complex. The Danes settled parts of England so thoroughly that the territory became known as the Danelaw, the law of the Danes, with its own administration, legal codes, and a Norse language that left marks on English that persist to this day. Words like sky, egg, knife, and window are Norse in origin, carried into the English language by the Vikings. In France, Norse warriors settled so permanently in the Seine estuary that the king officially granted them the land. They called it Normandy, the land of the Northmen. Within 2 generations, these descendants of Vikings spoke French, practiced Christianity, and had shed nearly all traces of Norse culture. But they kept their organizational brilliance, their appetite for risk, and their hunger for expansion. It was a descendant of those Norman Vikings, William the Conqueror, who crossed into England in 1066 and changed the course of Western European history forever. This is the first and most important pattern we need to recognize. The Vikings didn't disappear because they were wiped out. They disappeared because they integrated, because they were so successful that they arrived everywhere and left something of themselves behind everywhere while absorbing something new in return. But there was one place where integration came more slowly, one place where the Norsemen remained Norsemen longer than anywhere else, one place that embodies the slow, quiet end of the Viking world like no other. That place was Greenland. Before we reach Greenland, we need to stop in Iceland, because Iceland wasn't the beginning of the Vikings' western expansion. It was the first step into a world where the Norsemen were truly alone, without neighbors, without rivals, without the structures of the old world. Settlement of Iceland began around 870. According to Norse tradition, Irish monks, called papar by the Vikings, had been living on the island before the Northmen arrived. When the first ships came, the monks fled, leaving behind only their books and their bells, sailing into a silence from which they never returned. What the Vikings found in Iceland was breathtaking and brutal in equal measure. An island of volcanic beauty, geysers and glaciers, black lava fields and green valleys, rich in birds, rich in fish, rich in what Norse settlers needed most, space. Back home in overcrowded Norway, where farms passed from father to eldest son and younger sons had to fight for their place, Iceland was a promise. Here you could claim land, wide stretches belonging to no one, and start over. Settlement moved quickly. Within 60 years, the island was full. The available land was gone. And the Icelanders had built something remarkable. A society with no king. A society governed by the Althing, by communal agreement, and by the intricate web of family alliances described so vividly in the Icelandic sagas. But Iceland was also a place of exhaustion. The small birch forests the first settlers had found were rapidly cut down. The wood was needed for houses, for boats, for fuel. And when the forests were gone, erosion began. The thin Icelandic soil, no longer held in place by roots, was carried away by wind and rain. The island that had seemed so generous began slowly to hollow out. And again, it was success that created the crisis. Too many people, too much demand. An environment pushed to its limits, and again, some people sailed on. The man who found Greenland was named Eiríkur Thorvaldsson, known to history as Eric the Red, named for the color of his hair or his temper. He had fled Norway for Iceland after his father killed a man. In Iceland, he was banished for killings of his own. There was no room for him anywhere in the Norse world, so he sailed into the void. What he found was a coast of daunting beauty and equally daunting cold. He rounded the southern tip and found, on the western side of the island, helped by a fortunate warm climatic period, fjords with green shores and good grazing land. He spent 3 years exploring the coastline. When he returned to Iceland, he had a name ready for his discovery. He called it Greenland. It was, as some historians have noted, possibly the first successful marketing campaign in history. The island was anything but green, but the name attracted settlers, and around 985, a fleet of 24 ships left Iceland for the new land. Only 14 arrived. The Norse settlement of Greenland had begun. What the settlers built in Greenland was remarkable, and it was doomed from the start, though no one could have known that yet. There were 2 settlements. The eastern settlement in the south of the island, where Eric the Red had established his farm at Brattahlid, and the western settlement further north, smaller and more vulnerable, in the area of modern-day Nuuk. At the height of Norse Greenland, sometime in the 12th or early 13th century, perhaps 4,000 to 5,000 people lived there. They kept cattle, sheep, and goats. They hunted caribou, seals, and walrus, and they exported goods of extraordinary value to Europe: walrus ivory, seal pelts, live polar bears sold to European kings, and occasionally falcons prized for hunting. In return, they imported what Greenland couldn't produce: timber, iron, grain, and the goods of European civilization. This dependence on imports was the settlement's fundamental weakness. It was not a self-sustaining colony. It was an outpost at the far end of a long, fragile supply chain. Life was hard, but not without dignity. The Greenlandic Norse built churches. Excavations have uncovered at least 12. They had their own bishop, resident at Gardar in the eastern settlement. They were fully integrated into Christian Europe, paid taxes to the Norwegian crown, and sent tithes to Rome. But they lived at the edge, and at the edge, the margins for error are thin. Around the year 1000, the climate of northern Europe and the North Atlantic was unusually mild. Historians call this the medieval warm period, several centuries during which temperatures were higher than in the periods before and after. It was this warmth that had made Norse expansion possible. Greener shores in Greenland, more open sea routes, better harvests in Iceland and Scandinavia. But the warm period wasn't permanent. It was a breath, a pause in the North's long history of cold. From the late 13th century onward, slowly and relentlessly, the climate began to shift. What scientists now call the Little Ice Age started making itself felt. Average temperatures dropped, not dramatically, not like a sudden winter arriving overnight. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, across generations, a summer that was slightly shorter, an autumn that set in slightly earlier, a sea that stayed frozen slightly longer. For the Greenlandic Norse, this change was devastating. Their farming depended on a growing season that was already at the absolute outer edge of what was possible. As temperatures dropped, summers grew too short for grain. The grass that sustained their livestock grew thinner. The animals grew smaller. Archaeological finds show that cattle from the late Norse period were significantly smaller than those of earlier generations, a sign of chronic undernourishment over many decades. At the same time, the sea routes changed. The pack ice expanded. The traditional crossings between Greenland and Iceland grew more dangerous. Ships that had once come and gone regularly stopped coming. The supply lines on which the settlement depended grew thinner, and the world Greenland traded with was changing too. Now, the silence of the market. Economic decline. Walrus ivory was the economic lifeblood of Norse Greenland. For generations, the Norsemen had sailed far north each summer, into the region they called Nordersetur, the northern hunting grounds, well above the Arctic Circle, to hunt walrus. The tusks were shipped to Europe and used as a substitute for elephant ivory, altar carvings, chess pieces, the decorative objects of churches and courts. Then Africa opened up. With the rise of Portuguese sea trade in the 14th and 15th centuries, new routes brought real elephant ivory flooding into European markets. Walrus tusk, valued largely because elephant ivory was scarce in Europe, lost its worth rapidly. There, prices fell, and with them fell the economic reason for Greenland to exist. The Greenlandic Norse were producing goods that Europe was less and less willing to pay for, and in return, they were receiving less and less of what they needed to survive. A ledger from Bergen dating to the early 14th century lists all goods traded across the North Atlantic. Greenland still appears, but the entries grow sparser with each decade, until the land stops appearing at all. It wasn't a dramatic break, no decision, no decree, just a slow disappearance from the account books, a coastline that ceased to exist, not because it sank, but because no one sailed there anymore. But the Norse were not alone in Greenland. While the Norse settlements in the south and southwest of the island struggled and slowly crumbled, another people were moving south from the north. The Thule Inuit, ancestors of modern Greenlanders, migrated from the Canadian Arctic and reached the Greenlandic coast in the 13th century. the encounter between these two cultures is fascinating and mysterious. Archaeological finds confirm contact. In Inuit settlements, metal objects of clear Norse origin have been found. Iron knives, bronze buckles, chain links. In Norse settlements, there are occasional traces of things that could only have come through Inuit trade. But what this contact meant, whether it was friendly or hostile, whether the two groups traded or fought, is impossible to say with confidence from the sources. The Norse written record describes the Inuit with a single word, skralingar, the same word used in the sagas for the indigenous people of North America. It has a dismissive tone, roughly meaning barbarians or weaklings, and that alone says much about the Norse attitude. What we know is this: the Inuit were better adapted to the Greenlandic environment than the Norsemen. In a world that was growing colder, they had technologies far superior to Norse ones. The kayak, the umiak, the dog sled, the igloo, the art of Arctic hunting, all of this allowed the Inuit to live and thrive in an environment that was becoming a trap for the Norse. Some historians have argued that if the Norsemen had adopted Inuit technologies, learned to build kayaks and hunt seals the Arctic way, they might have survived. But they didn't. For whatever reason, cultural pride, religious hesitation, the deep human inability to abandon one's worldview under extreme pressure, the Greenlandic Norse remained what they were: European farmers, in a world that could no longer sustain European farmers. In 1347, a catastrophe reached Europe that had nothing to do with Greenland or the Vikings, and yet sealed the fate of the northernmost Norse settlement in the world: the plague. The Black Death killed between a third and half of Europe's population in less than a decade. Entire cities were emptied, trade routes collapsed, institutions that had lasted centuries dissolved. For Greenland, already clinging to the outermost edge of the European economy, the plague wasn't a direct threat. It likely never reached the island, but it was an indirect catastrophe of enormous scale. The trading houses in Bergen that had organized the Greenland trade were decimated. The men who had funded and equipped the ships died or fled. The Norwegian royal administration that had maintained contact with its Greenlandic colony collapsed under the weight of demographic shock, and so the ships stopped coming. The last ship recorded in Norwegian sources as having arrived in Greenland came in 1406. It was stranded there for several years while bad weather prevented the return voyage. During that time, a wedding took place, the last Norse wedding on record from Greenland. A man named Thorstein Olafsson married a woman named Sigridur Björnsdottir. The ceremony was held at the church in Hvalsey, whose ruins still stand today. Stone walls at the edge of a quiet fjord, the last tangible symbol of Norse life in Greenland. The ship sailed back to Iceland in 1410, and with that, documented contact between Europe and the Norse settlements of Greenland comes to an end. What happened after that in the Western settlement, and finally the Eastern settlement, we don't know for certain. Archaeological finds show no signs of violent end. No burn marks, no mass graves, no evidence of catastrophe. The houses were abandoned but not destroyed. The churches stood empty, but they stood. Sometime between the early and late 15th century, the last Norsemen of Greenland stopped living. But before the quiet end in Greenland came a final, astonishing expansion. Around the year 1000, a young man named Leifr Eriksson, son of Eric the Red, sailed west from Greenland. He was following reports brought back years earlier by a trader named Bjarni Herjolfsson, accounts of an unknown coastline to the west, glimpsed during a storm voyage never explored. Leif landed. What he found was a series of coasts he explored and named in turn. Helluland, the flat stone land, possibly Baffin Island; Markland, the forest land, possibly Labrador; and finally a coastline he named Vinland, the wine land, after the wild grapes or berries his men found there. Vinland lies somewhere on the coast of North America. For decades, its exact location was debated. Then, in the 1960s, excavations at a site called L'Anse aux Meadows on the northern tip of Newfoundland uncovered unmistakably Norse structures. Turf houses, iron slag, a bronze pin, things that could only have come from European Norsemen. The proof was there, 500 years before Columbus. 300 years before the Crusades, the Vikings had reached North America and built a settlement. But the settlement didn't last. Perhaps 10 years, perhaps less. The sagas describe conflicts with the indigenous inhabitants, again called Skraelingar. The numbers didn't add up. The Norse were too few, too far from their base, too dependent on supply lines from Greenland, which was itself already an outpost. The resources of Vinland tempted, but not enough to overcome the settlement's strategic weakness. They sailed back, and America waited another 500 years for Europe to return. It's one of history's most tantalizing what-ifs, but the pattern is the same as everywhere else. The Norsemen reached the possible, and in doing so exceeded the sustainable. They came, saw, touched, and withdrew. While the outer edges of the Norse world were slowly shrinking, its inner life was changing just as profoundly. Norse religion, the belief in Odin, Thor, Freya, and the other Aesir, was not a dogmatic system. There was no priesthood in the Christian sense, no sacred scripture, no systematic theology. It was a living mythology, present in daily practice, in seasonal sacrifices, in runic inscriptions and the songs of the skalds. And it was a mythology that ended in doom. Ragnarok, the fate of the gods, was no Christian-style apocalypse pointing toward salvation. It was the prophecy of the world's end, the gods' own end. Odin dying in the jaws of the wolf Fenrir, Thor fighting his final battle against the Midgard serpent. And after that, silence. Perhaps a new world. But the old one, with all its gods, irretrievably gone. The Christianization of Scandinavia came with the power of kings. Around the year 1000, King Olafur Haraldsson, later canonized as Saint Olaf, stood before the task of converting Norway. His methods were far from gentle. Villages that refused conversion were burned. Chieftains who held to the old gods were forced to choose between baptism and death. Iceland holds a special place in this story. At the Althing of the year 1000, the Icelandic chieftains debated whether to convert. After long, heated argument, the decision was handed to the law speaker, Thorgeir Ljósvetningagodi. He withdrew beneath his cloak for a day and a night, speaking to no one, and then delivered his verdict. Iceland would become Christian. The old gods would be set aside. But, in characteristically Icelandic fashion, anyone was free to continue the old rituals in private, as long as they publicly accepted Christianity. With that decision, the Old Norse religion was sealed to its end, not with fire and sword as in Norway, but by a democratic vote on a winter's day at an assembly of free men. The old gods died, not in battle as Ragnarok had foretold. They died by a show of hands. Alongside the religious change, a political transformation was taking place that was equally profound. Norse society in the early Viking Age was decentralized and fluid. Power was distributed across chieftains, jarls, and petty kings, who maintained their authority through personal loyalty, generosity in the mead hall, military success, and the intricate web of honor and obligation that held Norse society together. But through the 10th and 11th centuries, powerful rulers began the processes that would produce centralized kingdoms. In Norway, Iceland, Sweden, and Denmark, the old dispersed order of chieftains was gradually absorbed into something that looked increasingly like the rest of feudal Europe. Many of those who had sailed to Iceland had done so precisely because there was no room left for independent men in the new Norway. But Iceland was not immune. In 1262, after decades of brutal civil wars between rival clans known as the Sturlunga Age, Iceland submitted to the Norwegian crown. The free commonwealth the early settlers had built ceased to exist. The Norse world became a world of kingdoms, of hierarchies, of institutions that looked more and more like those of the rest of Europe. And with that, something fundamental in the Norse character either disappeared or transformed so thoroughly it was no longer recognizable as Norse. The moment of the end. When did the Vikings stop existing? There is no single date. That is the unsatisfying and truthful reality of the Vikings' end. There was no final battle in which a Viking army was destroyed. No last ship that didn't return. No last king who died without heirs and took a people with him into the grave. But if you're looking for a symbolic moment, a day when the Viking world noticeably stopped being what it had been, it might be September 1066. That month, King Harald Hardrada of Norway landed on the English coast with a powerful fleet. He was a man of the old type, a Norse warrior who had served in Byzantium, who had crossed half of Europe, who believed England was his by right because the Vikings had once ruled it. He was the last flicker of an old world. At the Battle of Stamford Bridge 3 weeks before William the Norman landed at Hastings, Harald Hardrada was defeated and killed. The surviving Norwegians, of 300 ships, 20 returned home, sailed north, and with them sailed something that would never come back. The age of the great Viking raids was over. 3 weeks later, William the Conqueror, a descendant of Vikings who no longer spoke Old Norse and would never have called himself one, crossed into England and launched an invasion that permanently reshaped the country's history. It was, in a certain sense, the last Viking expedition, except that the Vikings no longer recognized themselves. But to disappear is not to vanish without a trace. The Norse world left marks carved deep into the foundations of modern European civilization, so deep we no longer think of them as Norse. The English language carries the Norse inheritance in thousands of everyday words. The days of the week, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, are named after Norse gods, Tyr, Odin, Thor, Frigg. The parliamentary traditions of Iceland, the Althing, founded in 930 and the oldest continuously functioning parliament in the world, are a direct continuation of Norse legal culture. The legal systems of Scandinavia, regarded today as among the most progressive and just in the world, have deep roots in the Norse Thing tradition. The idea that law emerges from communal agreement, not royal decree. The sagas, the Icelandic prose works of the 13th century, recording the stories of the Viking Age, are a literary legacy of striking maturity. Their psychological depth, moral ambiguity, and spare, almost journalistic storytelling have influenced generations of writers. J.R.R. Tolkien, who studied and taught Norse mythology, drew much of Middle-earth from the fabric of Norse legend. And there is Russia. The foundation of the Russian state, or at least its earliest form, is inseparable from Norse heritage. The Varangians who navigated Russia's rivers founded Novgorod and Kiev. Rurik, the legendary founder of the Rus dynasties, was by tradition a Varangian. From this Norse-Slavic synthesis, over centuries one of the largest political entities in the world emerged. This is the quiet paradox of Viking history. A people who seemed to vanish actually flowed into almost everything that came after. Now, let's return to that lonely farmhouse in Greenland. It no longer stands, but archaeologists have found it, or what remains of it. Beneath the permafrost, which in some parts of Greenland preserves everything it covers, they found things that tell a story without words. A comb made from whalebone, a piece of cloth in a European weave, animal bones showing that in the final decades of the settlement, the people were eating more and more seal meat and less beef. A sign of survival instinct, adaptation to an environment that allowed less and less room. In a cemetery in the eastern settlement, skeletons were found showing signs of chronic malnutrition. The people had grown shorter over generations. They suffered, they fought, they prayed. And in their last church, the small, stubborn stone chapel at the edge of a Greenlandic fjord, archaeologists found traces of services held long after any connection to the outside world had broken. After no bishop came anymore, after no ship anchored, they kept praying to a god who was far away, in a church no one else knew about. That is perhaps the most moving image of the end of the Norse world in Greenland. Not panic, not flight, but the quiet, tenacious refusal to let go of what they were, until the ice made it impossible. One last question remains. What became of the last Norsemen of Greenland? 3 theories have emerged among historians and archaeologists, and none of them fully rules out the others. The first says they died. The final hard winter, the final failed harvest, the final ship waited for in vain, and they starved or froze because no one came to help. This theory is supported by skeletal evidence showing undernourishment and physical decline across generations. The second says some sailed back. On self-built boats, or perhaps on a last vessel that arrived unrecorded in the sources, some made it back to Iceland or Norway. Perhaps they arrived and were absorbed, nameless, historyless, swallowed into the mass of late medieval European society. The third theory, the most romantic, but not the most impossible, says some went to the Inuit. In Inuit oral tradition, there are stories of people who were different, lighter, with different tools, with unfamiliar customs. Oh yeah, and in the DNA of modern Greenlanders, scientists have recently found traces of European ancestry that may point to possible intermingling between the cultures. The interpretation of this data is disputed, but it doesn't rule out the possibility. Perhaps some of the last Greenlandic Norse became Inuit. Perhaps they set aside their European clothing, learned the kayak and Arctic hunting, forgot their language and their runes, and became part of another world. Perhaps their descendants still live today on the coasts of Greenland, with no idea what history lies sleeping in their bones. We don't know. We may never know. And that uncertainty is, in a way, a fitting end for a people who always sailed toward the unknown. We're now in a position to answer the question we started with. Why did the Vikings disappear? The answer is layered. It was not a single blow. It was, as so often in history, a perfect storm of interconnected crises, each one reinforcing the others. It was climate change. The Little Ice Age made life at the outermost edges of the Norse world unbearable. In Greenland first, in Iceland more slowly but perceptibly. A colder world left less room for people who grew grain and kept cattle. It was economic transformation. The goods that Norse outposts produced, walrus ivory, seal oil, Arctic luxuries, lost their value as new trade routes brought new goods in greater quantities and at lower cost. The economic logic that had bound the Norsemen to their remote outposts no longer existed. It was political integration. The Norse kingdoms became part of Christian Europe. Their kings married European princesses, fought European wars, pursued European goals. The Norse world stopped thinking of itself as separate. It was religious transformation. The old gods died, and with them died a worldview that treated the open sea as a natural extension of human existence. And underneath all of it, it was success itself. The Vikings were so good at what they did, trading, colonizing, fighting, navigating, that they permanently changed the world they lived in, and a changed world had no more room for them as they were. They disappeared because they transformed, because they flowed into Normandy and became the Normans, because they sank into Russia and became the Rus, because they stayed in England and helped shape the English, because they stayed in Iceland and became Icelanders. The Vikings didn't disappear. They became everything else. At the end of this long journey through fjords and frozen seas, through lost settlements and dying gods, one question remains. Why do we still tell this story? Partly because it's extraordinary. The story of a people who pushed the boundaries of the known world, who settled Iceland, reached North America, served Constantinople, founded Russia, is simply one of the most thrilling stories humanity has to offer. But there's a deeper reason. The story of the Vikings is a story about limits, about what happens when people push against the edges of their environment. The Norsemen built settlements in regions that couldn't sustain them long term. They deforested Iceland. They overstretched Greenland. They sailed to North America and couldn't stay because the base they came from was itself too fragile. That sounds familiar. It sounds like a story that isn't only set in the past. The Vikings saw themselves as people who could always go further, who would always find another horizon, always another coast, always more room. And for a time that was true. But the earth is round, the horizons end, and if you sail far enough, you come back to the same problems, the same limits, the same questions. But there's another echo, one of strength. The Greenlandic Norse kept holding services after no one answered. They stayed when reasonable planning might have said to leave. They held to what they were, in a world that had stopped making room for them. No saga sings of that courage. No scald poem praises the man who keeps holding mass in a small stone church at the edge of the world, long after the last ship sailed away. But perhaps it is the most remarkable form of bravery of all. Not the courage of the charge, but the courage of endurance. The Vikings gave us words. They gave us laws. They gave us trade routes and cities and literary traditions. They gave us the democratic idea that justice emerges from community. They gave us North America and took it back because the time wasn't ready. And they left us a lesson that stands in the silent ruins of Greenland, waiting to be read. That civilizations don't die from weakness. They die from their own limits. When the world they built stops fitting who they are. Tonight, we began with an image. A lonely farmhouse in Greenland, half buried under snow. The hearth cold, the tools still in their places. Now, at the end of our journey, we see that image differently. It is not an image of failure. It is an image of the furthest reach of a human project, the greatest maritime adventure of the pre-modern world. People who set out from the narrow fjords of Norway and stretched themselves across the earth as far as it was possible to go. Who held on generation after generation in places where life was harder than almost anywhere else. And in the end, when the ice came too close, when the ships grew too infrequent, when the world moved on without them, they let go. Not with shouting, not with a last stand, but with the quiet human dignity of those who have given everything and know that it was enough. The tools are still there, somewhere under the snow, waiting. And the silence of Greenland is not the silence of death. It is the silence of something that was completely, intensely, fully, and then ceased to be, like a breath, fully exhaled, like a fire that burned down to the last piece of wood, like a story that found its ending. Thank you for joining me tonight on this long journey into the past. I hope the story of this people has brought the beauty and mystery of the Norse world to life for you. I wish you a calm and peaceful night.